Thank you everyone for joining us today for the ClimateEd Education for Climate Action event. It's great to be here and it's great to have such a big audience. We're very excited to be here to discuss the bidirectional relationship between education and climate through a series of short and impactful talks, from the climate change impacts on education outcomes to the power of education in galvanizing climate action through improved mindsets and behaviors, skills, and innovation. I am joined here by a very esteemed set of speakers who will give a voice to each of the topics. So we have His Excellency Conrad Saki, Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education of Sierra Leone, Temi Salami, the Executive Director of Eco Champions Nigeria, Maria Soledad Bos, who's an Education Lead Specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Rob Jenkins, the Director of Education and Adolescent Development at UNICEF. But before I invite them to speak, I will abuse my opportunity to be here at the podium and say a few things to set the stage. For me, there is one simple but very powerful message that needs to be repeated over and over again. The global community is seriously underutilizing one of the most powerful instruments for climate action, which is education. Worldwide, education attainment is the single strongest predictor of climate change awareness. It is an essential component to fostering a shared understanding of the nature and impact of climate change, and this is a critical ingredient in all international, national, local, and most importantly, individual climate action. Worldwide, education is strongly correlated with concern for the environment and support for policies that benefit the environment. Research from the World Bank shows that one additional year of education can bring with it significant increases in pro-climate beliefs, behaviors, preferences, and voting. Education can foster both mitigation and adaptation through large-scale behavior change, skilling for green transitions, and innovation. People with more education are more resilient to the shocks and uncertainties brought on by a rapidly changing climate. And so, in essence, more educated individuals are better able to prepare for, cope with, and recover from extreme weather shocks. A key event in that education is that it can foster a climate action today and not just for the future. There is growing evidence that students of today are directly participating in climate action and are also influencing their parents, their teachers, their communities. But education remains extremely under-leveraged in mainstream climate discourse. Most government policies and plans for climate action hardly mention education. There is tremendous talk of cutting back emissions, and yet we're not thinking enough about reshaping individual mindsets, preferences, and behaviors to enable fundamental shifts for a livable planet. This is a huge oversight, considering that in many contexts, education is strongly correlated with support for policies that benefit the environment. Further, as much as 20 to 37% of the emissions reduction needed to achieve net zero depends on individual and household behavioral change. Similarly, the global community is discussing green transitions and green jobs, and yet we're not thinking enough about what skills are needed for these transitions and how to provide them at scale. World Bank is working with many governments, international organizations, and a range of other partners to change this. First, we have a global report on education and climate coming out in July 2024, so please stay tuned. And this report will present cutting-edge data and evidence on how precisely to harness education for climate action. It will discuss how to scale up education solutions for large-scale behavioral change, skilling for green transitions, and innovation. Second, more and more World Bank education projects are tackling the issue of climate change mitigation and adaptation. I look forward to working with you all to unleash the magic of education for effective and sustained climate action. So let me now invite the panel to the stage. So let me start with the esteemed Minister of Basic and Secondary Education from Sierra Leone, Conrad Saki, to give us some insights into the impacts that climate change is having on education.
Please permit me to use the Ds. Mr. Moderator, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a pressing and unjust crisis with the most severe consequences disproportionately affecting countries least responsible for it. Vulnerable communities bear the brunt of these impacts, exacerbating existing inequalities. Indeed, climate change poses a huge risk to children and their future. We are already seeing an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events such as heat waves, floods, droughts, and wildfires, as well as the probability of multiple of these events happening simultaneously. And the situation will only get worse as the warming continues. All of this translates into over 1 billion children being at risk of facing multiple climate shocks in their lifetime. Permit me to just go through 4 points. Firstly, extreme weather events affect education in both direct and indirect ways. For instance, extreme heat and droughts can make school environments less conducive to learning, by making it harder to study at high temperatures or limiting access to wash facilities. In other cases, as with cyclones, floods, landslide, they can close schools either temporarily or permanently, therefore stopping all learning from happening at once. Second, as the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education in Sierra Leone, I am reminded daily of these risks because of how vulnerable Sierra Leone is to these extreme weather events. Climate change is already manifesting in my country in a multitude of ways, including erratic rainfall patterns, extreme heat events, and more frequent flooding. The knock-on effects of these climatic shifts are pervasive and far-reaching across all nations, including the education sector, where school operations and access have been significantly affected, as well as the construction and renovation of school buildings. In 2017, Sierra Leone was hit with one of the most devastating mudslides in the country's history after a significant rainfall. The extreme event took the lives of over 1,000 people and left 5,000 people homeless. Over half of those affected by the disaster were children. Amidst the destruction, the mudslide flattened a school, and in the aftermath of the mudslide, schools in the affected areas were shut for a month. And those without significant damages were used as refuges for those who had lost their homes. These climate change impacts are resulting in learning loss, dropouts, and long-term consequences. We are already seeing these impacts. Recent World Bank research found that 245,000 students in Sierra Leone go to schools that have been flooded in the past 3 years, causing a significant learning disruption. Climate change also poses substantial hurdles. The extreme heat waves that accompany rising temperatures can disrupt the learning environment, making it difficult for students and teachers to concentrate and perform at their best. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Saki, for sharing us the breadth and depth of the impact of climate shocks in schools. Let me now move to Temi Salami to speak to us about how we can better leverage education for climate action.
Hi, everyone. I hope we're all doing well. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Temilade Salami from Nigeria, and I want to thank you all today for joining me as we explore the transformative power of education for climate action. I'm really glad that this is a COP that is discussing education. You don't find this every time. The key to a climate positive future lies not only in policy changes and new technologies, but also in individual choices and behaviors. While global agreements and national policies play crucial roles, it is the choices we make in everyday lives that collectively determine the trajectory of our planet's future. Education is indeed the bedrock for shaping all these three things, from policy to technology and behavior. My first key message to you today is that education is one of the most powerful instruments for fostering pro climate behaviors. For example, a 1 year course provided to university students has been shown to reduce their carbon emission by 2.86 tons of CO2 per year. My second big message is that young people are already playing an active role in the issue of climate change. There is no doubt that education will make us much more effective and prepare us for the future of green jobs. A 2018 PISA data from across countries highlights student desire to contribute positively to the well being of our planet. On average, 80% of the global youth agree that looking after the environment is important to us. However, many students need more basic climate knowledge. A forthcoming World Bank report shows that in Bangladesh, 93% of grade 8 students believe that climate change is happening, but only 32 were able to answer a basic question about greenhouse gases correctly. As you can see, there is indeed a huge gap. We must harness students' climate concerns for effective action by equipping them with the knowledge and skills. And as for me, for the past 6 years, I have been working with young people in Africa through my organization called Eco Champions and our various climate change education initiatives. We have been fostering a community of proactive and environmentally conscious individuals who are being inspired to make a difference for the planet. Through our innovative training programs, fellowships, and resources, we provide a platform for young people like me to deepen their understanding of climate change and also take action in their communities. We do all of these that I just mentioned, bearing in mind that there is no climate action without climate education. Teachers are not left behind. The same World Bank report shows that more than 80% of teachers across five low and middle income countries believe that education can and should make a difference in climate action. Around 79% of teachers are already including climate related base themes in their lessons, and nearly 71% of teachers got at least one basic climate question wrong. From this data evidence, it is really obvious that we need to train and empower teachers to shape our generation for climate mitigation and adaptation. No teacher must be left behind. Finally, a point that is sometimes overlooked in climate discourse is that foundational skills of literacy and numeracy are basic survivals in times of climate change. Without them, there's no climate action. A child who can read 1, 2, 3, and ABC cannot understand what net zero or 1.5 degrees Celsius is. 70% of 10 years old in low and middle income countries cannot read and understand a basic test. In South Asia alone, this number is 78%. And in sub Saharan Africa, where I come from, it is nearly 89%. It is really time to double down on improving foundational skills to foster a livable planet. We must make teaching and learning of climate education as fundamental as reading and writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Temi, and thank you for highlighting the importance of building foundational skills as well as those core pro-climate values so that they can nurture changes in attitudes and behavior. Now, let me go to the Soledad. Soledad, the IDB, has recently published a policy note that builds on the case for education and green citizenship. We look forward to hearing from you.
I will also take the stand. Everybody's talking here, so I want to talk here also. So as Luis mentioned, we just published a document at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I want to reflect on my personal journey on writing that report and what I've learned through these years working towards that report. I've been working for almost 2 decades in education in Latin America and the Caribbean. I've been working on and trying to understand what works in education and working alongside education policymakers to try to make a better learning experience for children and youth in the region. And I have to be honest that up to a few years, the word of climate change was not part of these conversations, but then something changed, and climate change is now part of that conversation. So at the Inter-American Development Bank, we set forth to try to understand what is that we know about Latin America on these issues, and what is that we want to see in the next few years, and what we can do about it, and how we can support countries in the region to improve these things. So one of the first things we learned, or that I learned in this process, is that children in Latin America and the Caribbean really don't know about climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability, for example. They're really not learning these things in school. We don't have good numbers to know exactly what they know about these things, but for example, the latest results that came out this week on PISA show that more than 50% of 15-year-olds don't know about science, and climate change is usually taught in the science classroom. So we can infer that most of them really don't know about the basic issues of climate change. We also know that from the same PISA results that 25% of youth in Latin America don't really know what climate change is. When you ask them directly what is climate change, they really don't know. And we also know that they feel disempowered. They don't feel like they have the capacity to act on behalf of the environment. And that is added to what was just mentioned about foundational skills. The results of PISA for Latin America and the Caribbean show that, for example, 75% of youth don't know basic concepts of math. So we have a crisis in the making, and this will affect what we call green citizenship. Kids will not be able to learn what they need to know about climate change to be able to have climate action and be empowered to live in the future world. So what is that we aspire? We aspire to have children and youth that are true green citizens. And when we talk about green citizens in the world, we want to have children that know about climate change and what the impact of climate change is and what the science behind climate change is. We also want to have kids that value the environment, and they think that it's important for their life, that it's important for the lives of others, that it's important for this generation and for the future generations. And we also want to have kids that have the capacity to act on behalf of the environment, that are problem solvers, that they can communicate, that they can work in teams to be able to solve all the problems that are going to be facing in a very changing world. So that's what we aspire to see in the future. And we can do it with tools that we have nowadays at our hands. We have to include climate change and these issues in the curriculum from pre-K all the way to post-secondary education, not only in science, but in all the courses. We need to also train teachers. We need to have materials that teach about and have the concepts included. So a second thing that we learn in this process is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we are to gain 15 million new jobs in the transition to net zero. But these jobs will require some sort of secondary education and will mostly be in sectors that are male-dominated. And we know that in Latin America and the Caribbean, most, or at least only like 60% of youth finish secondary education. And if we look at the kids that are at most disadvantaged and in rural areas, those numbers skyrocket. So those kids and those youth, when they graduate from school, will probably not have opportunities to access these jobs in the green economy. What do we want to see? We want to see those kids graduating from secondary education and with the right skills so that they can really take over those green jobs and all the opportunities that the new world and the new jobs will bring on. What else did we learn? We learned that climate change is impacting schooling, and if kids are not in school, they're not learning. So, for example, in Central America, just a few years ago, 2 big hurricanes hit the region, and 1,000 schools were destroyed. And in Honduras, schooling had to be cut by a whole month. And if these kids are not in school, they're not going to be learning. So we want to have education systems that are resilient, that can keep operating and be open when the hurricanes hit, when floodings hit. And we also want to have schools that can have proper learning environments, especially in a warming world that we're going to see probably in the next few years. We know that kids, when it's too hot, they're not learning, so we want to have good schools that can allow them to learn. And one final thing I want to mention is that we want to have sustainability in the education system and in the schools. We know that this is not only important because it adds value to the climate change agenda where we are today, for example, at COP28, but it's also a learning moment and a learning experience for kids that are attending these schools, and they can bring those sustainability practices they see in school into their daily lives and into their houses. So this is what we've learned, this is what we hope to see, and we have the tools at hand to be able to make this happen. And I do have a renewed sense of purpose in working in education, because I think that we can make a difference for all the children and youth, at least in my case, in Latin America and the Caribbean where I work, and I look forward to see what all these changes bring on. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Soledad. A great reminder of how to instill green citizenship in the next generation. And I think that we're here at COP28 on the big stage, and I think where we want to influence not just individuals but also societies on how to move the climate agenda, and in that sense also how to not only to have pro-climate behaviors, but also at the end of the day this will have to be realized through new types of jobs. So Rob will talk to us about how to think about green skills and the role of the education sector can play.
Yeah, and it's linked to the job market. Thanks, Louis. I knew when I saw the panel I was going to be terribly intimidated. This has not helped now that I've watched. I'm going to stay here to pretend that this is more of a dialogue. That may help a little bit. So I'm going to build on a lot that's been said, particularly by Maria, but the basic points I'm going to be making are the following. When we're looking at green skills, it's not one thing, and I would be very skeptical if for those very large-scale programs that are only zeroing in on one particular green skill. We're learning increasingly it's a breadth of skills. I'll come back to that. Secondly, the green skilling transition, as Maria had mentioned, it's already here, and I think if anything, there's a growing gap between the potential of the job market and the actual supply of the skills. I'll come back to that also. And we need to be intentional about inclusion, something Maria also touched on. So on the breadth, so look at, just skim your eyes through the list of skills. I wonder how many people would self-rate themselves highly on all of these range. But the bottom line is, as we all know, the demand for skills is growing. As Maria mentioned, the skills that you're able to acquire in your school system there's a very significant gap, even for those that are successful enough to stay in school for a long period, including in secondary school. So a very real challenge. So one main message, as I mentioned, think breadth of skills, 21st century skills, transferable skills as fundamental to enabling the transition to the green economy. As I also mentioned, excuse me, the demand is growing, and there's lots of stats, and actually both the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have some amazing examples of this, but the demand is enormous, and the potential is enormous for entrepreneurship-related green jobs as well. Here are just some examples. And actually, just in one kind of interesting stat there, as you can see, the percentage of the green jobs that are growing, but also the percentage of people that are listing green skills as part of their profile. Already there's a growing gap. So it's something that requires proactive narrowing by all of us. My friend here, Maria, mentioned about the importance of being purposeful around inclusion. Of course, you can have this conversation a whole bunch of different levels. It's not specific only to the green skills that I'm talking about now, but it definitely even is further exacerbated, I would argue, because of what Maria had mentioned. Often the skills that would tend to default in, that are required to enable one to have a green-related job, are traditionally still male-dominated. So we see a growing potential growing exacerbation of gender disparities, but other disparities as well, including children on the move, children living in poverty, children from ethnic minority backgrounds. Here are some examples, and obviously I won't go into that, but just at-scale initiatives around the world that are showing great promise. So while I think and others would, this is still a growing area, and we're learning a lot about what works at scale. There's some amazing initiatives that are reaching in large numbers of youth that are bridging this gap between skills and actual availability of jobs in this sector. So just to conclude and wrap up a few conclusions. One is, and it links to the breadth of skill point, we need to start early. Of course, I can't speak on behalf of UNICEF without highlighting the importance of early childhood education and primary education, but that's the beginning. But if we think of, at 17 or 18, I'm going to jump into the green sector, it comes back to many of the points that we've read. We need to start fundamentally and start young and enable the skill acquisition earlier and continue. Climate education, we need to think as a breadth of skills. And breadth is not only the demand requires often a breadth of skills, but obviously they're context specific. The skill I need in one country, in one area, one community will be different than in others. Participation is absolutely critical, and being intentional about inclusion. Here is a new acronym. Anyone want to? Youth on the Move. YOTM there. You see that? Basically, that means, and it links to this presentation because increasingly one of the reasons we know children, youth, adolescents are moving is because of climate change impacts and crisis-induced. So obviously a key population that we need to increasingly engage in is youth on the move. And lastly, and just to kind of wrap up, these skills need to be portable, they need to be adaptable, need to be wide-ranging, and I just come also back to, we need to be, as Maria also mentioned, intentional on inclusion. Thanks, Louis. Back to you.
Thank you, Rob. Let me perhaps try to wrap the panel up by just reflecting that we are at COP28. That means that there were 27 COP meetings before. This is the first time there is a Education Day, and that investments in education are investments in climate change, in climate action, and I think that again we've heard from this great set of panelists about how both education needs to be protected from climate shocks, that the impacts are grave. For every month that schools are closed, children lose about a month of schooling and learning, but also schools are important vehicles to promote pro-climate values, pro-climate behavior, both individually and socially. And ultimately also schools can be a great vector to support mitigation by being able to get ready the next generation for green jobs, green skills, both in terms of the importance of foundational learning as a vehicle to allow that adaptability and that growth mindset over the course of a lifetime. As society changes, jobs will change, but then at the same time to ensure that the types of skills that are needed for a greener world can be satisfied, so that we ultimately achieve the goal of reducing poverty, sharing prosperity, and be in a livable planet. So again, thank you all for participating today.
Thank you, Lawrence.